Hello and good evening. Today I have my colleague Michael with me and we talk about modern Angular. Hi, Michael.
Hello, Manfred. Hello, everyone connected. It's my pleasure to be here.
So, what is modern Angular about? Is it just a marketing gag or is there more behind this term?
Yeah, actually, modern Angular, like you have already heard, it's quite a bunch of new features that we received in the recent Angular major release, but also feature release versions. And some people even talk about Angular version 3 because so much is going on and this is changing the way we are writing our Angular applications today. And what is actually something very exciting for the Angular community is also something that is worrying some people, maintaining bigger code bases, because people need some kind of a good strategy on how to refactor their code base and decide when to use which of all those new modern APIs that the Angular framework offers for us.
Mhm. So, talking about migration, do we need to migrate everything at once to those new features, or can we do it little by little, or can we even stick with traditional Angular?
Yeah, that's the perfect question, and this is also what people are concerned of. It's not the same thing like between Angular 1 and 2, Angular JS and the modern Angular world. It's more that the Angular team introduced the new APIs in a very, very good backward compatible manner. They were even they received even a lot of appreciation even from outside the Angular ecosystem. People were really we're really happy about the way the Angular team introduced all those new APIs. That means you can always use them side by side. So you can use ng modules together with the new standalone APIs that were production ready with Angular 15. And the same applies for the other new APIs like signals and the new control flow that we will look into a little bit later.
Oh yeah, that sounds interesting and also relieving. So I think you've prepared an example showing us some of those new APIs and concepts. Do we want to look into it?
Definitely. Yeah, let's look into the shared screen. Basically, what you can see right now is a running Angular application using our demo example, like the flight search engine that we love to work with, demonstrating all the new features. What you can see right now is an application that consists of a sidebar here on the left, a header bar on top, and this main area here rendering at the moment the home component, but we could also navigate to the booking area here, looking up some flights here from Hamburg to Graz, where I am living. And basically, we would like to now focus on the source code of this application. So first of all, let's look into our code base for this Angular application. And we could start with the main TS file. The main TS file is the most important file to really bootstrap your Angular application. That means in the past, we had a bootstrapping that referenced the app module. Today, we can write our Angular applications, if you like, even without any ng module, or also parts of the application with ng modules, other parts with the new standalone APIs. In this case, my root component, the app component, is already implemented and configured as a so-called standalone component. So what you can see here is really bootstrap application and then a reference, my root component, my app component. And this app component is implemented in the app component TS file. And you may wonder, why only one file? Why not the typical 4 files that the Angular CLI normally generates out? It's basically your decision. So you can still use 4 files. You can get rid of the styling file if you have no CSS or SCSS stylings for your component. And you can even inline your template if you like. This is nothing new. This is nothing that is really connected to standalone APIs. We could use this this way of inlining templates also with ng modules, but it's getting a little bit more popular lately. So it means if you have only a small number of markup lines here in the HTML template, then maybe it's also a good way to inline them into one file. As you can see here, the whole app component file just has 34 lines of definition. So basically, not that much that it is necessary to really put it into different files. But if you prefer that, nothing stops you from that. So it's still supported to put it into a separate HTML file. What we can see here is a basic skeleton of the running application that we've seen. So just the wrapper tag here, and then the sidebar and the header bar and the router outlet. That's the placeholder for the Angular router to basically render out the use case component, the smart component that we have seen before on the screen for looking up our flights. And it's based and determined by the router UL, so the navigation that is currently active in your Angular application. We would like to focus now on the sidebar here. So the sidebar is basically one of the dependencies of this app component. We can see this here in the imports. So this component is using a router outlet. This component is using a header bar and the sidebar, and we would like now to focus on the sidebar. So I click into my core UI sidebar component.ts file, and here you can see add component decorator again. So another Angular component, again with an inline template here, because once again, not that many lines of definition here. And we will even reduce them in the next step, because I would now like to refactor this list here of navigation items. So those are the links that you have seen in the sidebar before in the running application: home, booking, check-in, and luggage. I would like, and also boarding, of course, I would like to refactor them into an own navigation component. And for that, I can use the Angular CLI down there, ng generate, so G for generate component. And then I would like to use the core folder. Inside the core folder, I have a UI folder, and the UI folder is the one where my header bar, my sidebar, and so on reside. So I would like to generate a navigation component into that folder. It's already per default a standalone component. So if you want to opt out of that, standalone false, then it would generate a component without the flag set here. So standalone would then not be defined or set to false, and it would then be a normal component that you know from your ng module setups that needs to be declared in one of the modules. In my case, it's fine to generate really a standalone component, and the last thing I need to define is here the project where I want to generate this in. So it's the project flight. Let's give it a try to generate everything out. Then per default, we get again those 4 files that you typically expect from Angular component. And I would like then to move my navigation list out of the component here and put it in the template of the newly generated one. So this is now the home of our here. And those navigation items to be rendered out on the screen require to have some Angular framework features applied. So in this case, the router link active directive, the router link active, and maybe later on also some other directives that we might use. So to get access to that, so that we can really use them in the template, I use my imports array here, and I import router link. So that way I tell my navigation component, there is a specific framework feature here, in this case the router link. If you want to use that in the template, it's necessary to import it here. The same for the router link active. Fine. Then those symbols are known, and I can really use them here in the template. That means they would have an active logic applied here. As soon as I click on one of the links, the router would try to navigate to the home segment. And if the home segment is currently the active route, the route that is also shown in the address bar of your browser, then it would activate or set the active class. And based on your stylings in your design system here, the active class could mean that a specific navigation item is selected on the screen so that the user knows where the current navigation is actually active, that the user is currently on the home, on the booking, on the respectively on the check-in route, wherever. So I save this for a moment. And then let's look into our component file here. Here we can see a selector, app navigation. And if I want to use that selector in my sidebar component now, I would need to import my navigation component. Navigation component down there. Now, again, it's a known dependency here in this component. That means I can use the tag here in my template. I can use the tag name, and Angular also supports now self-closing tags. So that means if you have no content HTML elements that you need to pass into your child component here, in this case into the app navigation component, then it's perfectly fine to close the tag immediately without an opening and afterwards closing tag, but you can use self-closing tags here, a feature that was also quite requested by the community because other frameworks also support this. So let's save this. And then we can look back into our running application live. So I already refreshed this. And let's give it a try. Now we have the navigation links here. The active link is selected again. So actually the same appearance that we had before, but this time refactored into a child component. So nothing new for the user that uses our application, but for us, it's actually using a different structure now. And we can now use and take a focus on this component and get rid of all those static definitions here. So basically, let's get rid of all the links beside one of the list items. And then we could add, for example, the new control flow. That would mean instead of an ng4, you know, the asterisk and then ng4 and iterating over a specific iterable like an array, for example, I can now use a new syntax, the new control flow, so-called, the add4 here. And the add4 allows me to use a syntax that is quite close to JavaScript and to an implementation block here for a for loop. I can move my list item into that. And now I can say, please iterate over a specific iterable. And for that, we can create a new one. For example, we could say there is a navigation items list. Let's call it navigation items. And here we can, for example, use the new signals API. One of the new signal APIs. For example, we could allow this component to receive navigation items from its parent component. That would look like that. We can specify an input here. So we can import the input from the Angular core package. And the maybe surprising thing right now is we don't need a decorator anymore. So in the past, we used imports with decorators. Now with the signal APIs, we have functions. And if you like, you can also say this should be a required import. So your parent component needs to provide this navigation items input. Otherwise, we would receive an error immediately in the IDE. So in the template of your parent component, you would have a red underlining if no one actually binds a correct type, correct value to this child component. And then we also need to tell this navigation component, or TypeScript in this case, which data structure do we expect here. And in this case, I would like to use a string array. So that way. And now let's turn back to my sidebar. What we can see right now, exactly what I mentioned, the app navigation is now underlined. And if I hover over that, it gives me the information nav items from the component must be specified because it's a required input. Otherwise, there's something wrong and basically the application cannot compile correctly. So in this case, we could also add the nav items here. In this case, I can turn them to protected, for example, because protected allows you to use properties, not only for inheritance, because normally you use protected with inherited classes. Basically here you can also use protected now for all those variables that should be accessible by your own template, but by no one else outside of that instance that is used during runtime. So if someone has access to the sidebar component instance, only inherited classes could access the nav items and the template, but no one else. So in this case, I would say I would like to have some simple state here, and for that, I would like to manage my state here inside a signal. And this signal could be an array of strings. So in this case, my navigation links that I would like to manage: home, and maybe boarding, and maybe booking. Guess we had booking first, so let's move it up. And then we had check-in, and also luggage. Fine. So some items that we added here as a state, and now this is already a signal. We can pass this down to our navigation component, nav items. Here I would like to do a property binding, so the square brackets, and I would like to pass in my nav items. And don't forget about the signal read, because to access the value of my own sidebar component state, I need to call the parentheses here, so call it as a function. And then the current value, which is the current value, it's a string array, is passed down to my navigation component. And the navigation component itself, as we've seen, has also nav items now as an input binding, and can use those nav items inside the template. So again, we can use a nav items signal here with a capital I, and we can iterate over that and say nav of nav items. And then with this new control flow, the add4, we need to tell the Angular framework the so-called track information. So we tell the framework, please, if there is a change over time, so if the nav items array changes, what is actually the value, the property of an object, or the primitive value in this case of the string that we need to use to compare our values. That's an assistance for the Angular framework, so that the Angular framework knows when it needs to destroy a list element or when it only needs to update a list element. In this case, I tell the Angular framework the item should be directly compared by its value. Sorry, it's nav in this case. So the nav value, the current item of the iteration, shall be, it's a string in our case, shall be directly compared. And if it's the same value, then the Angular framework knows, okay, we can use that value and just use it here inside our so-called embedded view. So the list item that is generated for each item here in the nav items array. And now we can directly access that string. So in this case, I can use it here in my router link. And here I need a property binding now, because I'm reading a variable, and I say this string that was passed in here shall be used for the router link. And the same shall be applied for the class here. So in this case, I would like to set a class with ng class. This is one of the directives that we can use out of the common package. So ng Angular directives inside our template. So in this case, I switch this to ng class. I use a property binding here again. That's again the possibility to access some values here. And I say I would like to use icon here, and in addition, single quotes, of course. And I would also like to use icon as a prefix, and I will add the name of the root, because this has also a CSS class that renders then out the navigation item, so nav in our case. And then down there as a label for my navigation link, I would like to use a string interpolation. And again, my root nav. Fine.
So let's recap a bit
Save
on this.
Just a moment to read.
Mhm.
Yeah, fine.
So we've seen several things now. One thing was about standalone components. I guess it's about brevity. We don't need to write that much anymore. But what are the advantages of the new control flow and of signals?
Yeah, definitely. So the control flow here that we have used inside our template, on one hand, it's definitely easier to read. At least the Angular team did some research and asked the community, and they were even involving the community on how the syntax should exactly look like. If it comes to the @ symbol here, for example, there was another syntax discussed before. And basically the idea was, on one hand, to make the templates easier to read. So that you don't have these nested attributes anymore that we used with ng4 and ngif, for example. They are still supported, and you can still write your own so-called structure directives, but it's more easier to read that way. And it also has a performance impact, a positive performance impact. That means the framework can render such embedded views more performant because the compiler is directly involved, and it does not necessarily need to instantiate directives during runtime before it can iterate over those items, but it's really built into the compiler and into the rendering engine Ivy that we can use the new control flow directly without any imports of directives. Yeah.
Does it also correlate somehow with signals?
Yes, also for signals, at least for the future, it has some benefits. So signals at the moment give you kind of an advantage that you get reactive updates. So my template here, if it is reading this nav items signal here, will automatically be notified if this array, so let's switch back to the state that we defined here. We defined this here as a string array, a signal of type string array. What does this mean in practice? You can imagine this just like a box. You have a box, and this signal is our box, and you can put a type correct value into that box. So any string array can be a value of this nav item signal. You can put this into the box, and as soon as you set a new value, the process of setting that value can automatically inform your component template here that the component template now knows, hey, this array changed, so I need to do something. And this they already implemented parts of this for an adapted, more performant change detection. And in future, with the so-called signal-based components, we'll receive some future updates here that the whole Angular application and each component and even parts of the component, so a single list item here in the for loop, for example, can be updated autonomously. So only those parts that really changed. And this is quite an influential, important step for the Angular framework for the future.
Nice.
Fine. We can also turn back to our running application. As you can see here, our navigation bar is now showing the correct items again. You can even turn back to the sidebar component and maybe just remove the luggage or out comment it here. And then we will see in a moment after it reloads. That now the luggage item is removed here. So the navigation link for luggage is removed. So that's the proof that we're really now working with a dynamic structure that is really dependent on the state that is actually provided into the sidebar component. We just hand this over, and the navigation component can then do the rest and just decide which link should be displayed in our application.
Nice.
Fine. We can even take some additional steps, and you could argue, for example, I just passed in some string names, and maybe only in your hello world use case, the root definition and the label to show on the screen and the name for the icon, they are always the same. That's true. Of course, this can be improved so that we could even allow provider definitions, for example, where we could map a root key to a specific icon name and to a specific label name. So all those things could be improved in this simple implementation now for this live coding, so that we could even have more advanced configurations that we maybe set with provider functions. That's a new way of configuring your application. Like also the Angular team is providing us with such provider functions. Like in the past, you remember we used the router module dot for root or for child to specify our routing configuration. Today, we can do this with so-called provider functions, and we can pass in only those features of the Angular router that we would like to use. So in this case, with component input bindings, for example, that would mean another new feature that the Angular router can map UL query parameters or dynamic parameters or data from your routing array, that can directly pass that data into the component input. So in our case, it would mean this is one of the component inputs. We could receive our navigation items out of parameter definition. Yeah. So
that's nice.
Simple example. Nice. Yeah, definitely.
That means we don't need to inject the activated route anymore and to subscribe on it and work with its observable. We just get a value and can work with it.
Definitely. That's the big advantage. The framework is also in that area getting easier. That means if you have a UL parameter or if you have here a data definition, each URL can have a data block here. Then we could also pass in our nav items here into the routing configuration, define some strings here, and they would be passed into our components. So for example, we could switch out the home component with the nav component, navigation component, for example. So this is quite a nice, simple API that has big consequences for your applications, basically. And once again, it doesn't mean that you're not allowed to use the activated root anymore. It just means if you're writing new features for your Angular applications, likely if you know about the new features, you can write that code quite easier than before. Interceptors, router guards, that maybe in some cases just be inlined here into your routing configuration as a function instead of a complex class. Yeah? All of that is possible, and it's possible, again, in a backward compatible manner.
Yeah, that sounds great. So far, this was really a cool example because you refactored it a bit, and so you introduced several of those new APIs like signals for reactivity and performance, standalone components for brevity, and even the new control flow syntax. And now we looked at how we can shorten everything in there when it comes to stuff like this here with parameters, routing parameters, for instance.
Yeah.
So what I'm seeing here in line 19 is lazy loading. However, I have the impression you are missing the 10 clause when using the import the import statement. So what's going on there? Why don't we have a 10 clause?
Yeah, you're right. That's just dummy code not working. No, just joking. This is another improvement of the Angular team. So basically, if you miss the then statement here, you're fully correct, but that's an alternative way of writing your lazy loading statements. So in the past, we needed to do this thing here. We needed to add the then clause, and then we received a module, and then we could say module dot and decide which symbol we would like to introduce. And this is already the spoiler. We can define those symbols, in this case, the routing configuration of our booking file here. So let's maybe switch to that booking file. In my booking folder, I have an index.ts file, and this index.ts file is pointing to a routing configuration. So this is a way that you likely know from Angular libraries that you can define your public APIs with such index.ts files. That would mean if someone tries to import something from this booking subfolder, it would only get those symbols that are exported here. And in this case, we use a default export. We can do the same here in the routing file directly. So you have just an array of routes here. And this is also something new, by the way. So you don't need your ng modules anymore in this area as well. You can, instead of the whole routing module that the Angular CLI generates out, maybe just to recap how this was used in the past, let's look into a booking module with the ng module approach. We have a booking module, and this booking module, if you generate this with -- routing, it also generates out a booking routing module here. And this booking routing module has a routes definition and an import for the router module for child, where it passes in exactly that route, and at the same time exports the routes for the main module, for the booking module here. And basically what the new API is capable of, you can get rid of the whole ng module part. You can just use the routes array here. So let's switch back to our booking implementation here with the lazy loading. And in this case, we can really use the booking routes directly for lazy loading. And if you also export them as a so-called default export, then you are allowed to get rid of the then statement here. So if there's a default export, the router automatically checks. Let's give this on the screen once again. So the router automatically checks, is the ECMAScript file, the ECMAScript module that is lazily imported here, does it have a property default? And if yes, it automatically connects that default export, and the whole then clause can be removed. It's again optional.
That's really nice.
It's not
I
required.
always forgot about this then clause, hence I'm a huge fan of this.
Yeah.
And no detour via the ng module anymore. We now directly point over to the next routing table. I really like this too.
Yeah, it makes things really simpler, and that's basically what we all strive for, right?
I think so, yeah. Awesome. So what do we have else in the world of modern Angular?
Yeah, there's a lot going on also on the build process side. So for example, the Angular team switched with Angular 17, so the current major release, at least for newly generated applications, already to a new build tool. What does this mean actually? Build tools is typically something that is hidden behind the covers of the Angular CLI. Up until Angular 16, we used the default Webpack for quite a long time. And now the Angular team switched per default, at least for new applications, to the so-called ES Build builder. And the ES Build builder gives you quite a lot of benefits. So it took some time for the Angular team to really implement all the features that it stays compatible with the previous build chain. But at the end, it gives you quite more performant build output. That means if you start the very same application with Webpack and then you migrate it, you change the Angular builder to the so-called new application builder. It's basically part of your Angular JSON configuration. So if we look into our Angular JSON file, you can see here the flight application that we're currently working with is built with @Angular devkit build Angular : application. So that's the new application builder that uses ES Build behind the covers for building your application, and Vite as a dev server. So it comes out of the Vue ecosystem, and this is now used as a dev server. Again, it's up to you. So you can check, is my current application that I migrated to Angular 17 that is per default using Webpack, is it also fully functional if I switch the configuration settings here to the new application builder, and also some properties here needs to be adapted, but not that many. Then you can try out is my application still working with the new builder? Then it's perfectly fine to immediately switch to the ES build pipeline and yeah, have quite better build time. Yeah, that's also one of the new features.
Yeah, this is one of the things we all want to have, improved build times, because it's always a burden if we need to go for a coffee when something is building.
Yeah.
So it's really cool.
Definitely, and we also want to have this compatible, right? No one is interested in refactoring the whole application to support a new build tool. So this is also the approach that the Angular team is following. It needs to be fully feature compatible until the Angular team even thinks of advising the community to switch over to a new build tools. And they did a good job in this area as well. Yeah.
Sounds good. So this was about the build time performance. What's about runtime performance? I think there are some new features that somehow also correlate until a certain point with the new control flow.
Yeah, definitely. We also have next to the add for and add if and add switch statement, we also have a so-called defer block. Let's look into that. I have already prepared a little bit. Maybe I'll show it first on the screen. Let's turn to my home component and reload the application maybe for a moment and back to my booking segment here. And as you can see here, the basket is not available yet. So it shows a message here, and then magically the basket area here pops up. What does this mean and how is this implemented? Because it looks a little bit like JavaScript magic after a specific amount of time or after a specific scrolling position, some elements appear. You know this from different public websites that on scrolling, magically images are lazy loaded into the viewport and so on. In this case, for my flight search component, let's look into the current implementation here. We have a feature here, flight search, and here's template. And inside this template, we use down there a defer statement here. And this defer statement has some triggers. And there are different triggers that are allowed. In this case, I just set a time-based trigger. So after 5,000 milliseconds, after 5 seconds actually, this block should be visible. In case the trigger is not has not taken effect yet because the condition is not fulfilled at the moment, we would render out a placeholder. So that was the paragraph that you have seen initially, that the basket is not available yet. And after a certain point of time, it gets loaded into my application. If you would use Angular component inside the template here, it would automatically put this component into a different bundle. That would mean what we can do with lazy loading, what we have previously seen in the app roots here with the load children statement, we can also do lazy loading in the template right now. That means a component referenced here would be put automatically by the build process into its own bundle. And this bundle is then only loaded if the condition takes effect. And you can really configure this on a fine-grained level with different default triggers like the viewport, for example. So to switch back to my application, I could, for example, say, please load the basket only after the user first interacted with those form elements here. Or if I have, for example, an active search here and the basket is not within the visible viewport, let's make this a little bit bigger here. I could also say, please load the basket for the very first time as soon as it scrolls into the viewport. And you can even combine those triggers. So you can say, first load the bundle as soon as 2 seconds or after a time-based trigger of 2 seconds, for example. And then as soon as the user scrolls that part into the viewport, the bundle is already loaded and then it's added to the DOM, for example. Yeah? So we have really now capabilities of using lazy loading inside our templates.
That sounds amazing, especially when loading times are a huge topic in, let's say, public-facing applications, shops, and so on.
Definitely. So initial load time, but also while you navigate inside the application, you can optimize the performance quite easily. Because if we would need to implement the very same strategy in JavaScript directly, we would need to deal with, for example, intersection observers to check where the what is shown in the viewport currently. So it would be quite more complex. The statements used here in the defer block are quite easy to tackle, quite easy to implement.
Yeah, it's really straightforward. Just pull this statement around it, add the defer, and Bob's your uncle.
Definitely. And you can even use your own conditions. And again, to close the circle, those conditions could be read out of a signal and so on. So all that part, of course, also signals and state management is a big topic. So also this is something where the third-party community members like the NGRX team and also other state management vendors did very excellent work and implementing new stuff into their libraries based on signals and based on the new control flow as well. So for example, also Angular Material supports the standalone APIs and control flow and so on.
Awesome. So I think when we talk about defer, we quite often also talk about further topics like hydration, SSR, server components. What's about this?
Yeah. If you looked on Twitter yesterday, maybe you saw there are even Angular cereals that you can use for your breakfast. And they were talking about,
I've seen it. Yeah. Very nice.
Quite funny. First April joke, right? And basically they were talking about hydration there as well. But there's really also not only April 1st joke about hydration. There's really a framework feature implemented. So Angular supports, for example, server-side rendering since quite a time, but the source code for that was part of a third-party namespace. So Angular Universal, actually. And they inlined all those implementations into the framework, and now have the target to enhance the server-side rendering story quite dramatically in a positive manner. That means the target is definitely that we can simply turn on server-side rendering per default. What does this mean in detail? Your application, if you load your application, so let's do a reload here once again. And then we can look into the source code of our current flight search component. So if we look into the source code here, you can really now find all the text that are shown on the screen. So it's not only the initial JavaScript or HTML markup, it's really even shows my navigation items that we have specified. So it's really runtime logic. That means your Angular application is really processed on the server, and the server already runs Angular, prepares the DOM, sends the correct DOM to the client, so that the browser can immediately render that without processing JavaScript at the beginning at all. And this basically means, and this is still an ongoing story where the Angular team improves the story, there's a certain handover necessary. So the first initial HTML markup that is sent to the browser then needs to connect to the running application that is processed inside your browser. And there's even a handover of state possible, where the state that was already processed on the server can be directly connected to the client. That's the so-called hydration process of putting rehydrating that content that was already processed on the server back to the client, because at a specific point of time, the client jumps in and is then managing your running JavaScript application. And in future, this story will even be enhanced with so-called partial hydration, where we can really hydrate only or make only parts of our Angular application active if those parts are needed. And as you can already guess, this is in future also connected to the defer behavior that we have just talked about. It's connected to signals again to have specific triggers where the updates need to happen and so on.
So that means I'm downloading a chunk of HTML and all the parts of the page will come to life eventually. Not at the moment, but when I need it. And so I just need to download as little as possible, which will improve my performance.
Exactly. This is one way, so the server can really actively calculate your current view, or you also have the option of pre-rendering. That means your build process can tell the build process which navigation route should be processed. So, for example, in my case, the home screen, for example, but also booking, flight search. Those are maybe the two views that I would like to pre-render, and then you can even pre-render HTML statically, deploy it to the server, and then the server doesn't need to run and process your Angular application on each and every request that one of the clients may do, but only send back the statically pre-rendered content. Yeah? So that is possible, and also ways in between. Yeah, so only recalculating on specific triggers.
Yeah. Will this also allow something like server components in React?
It's quite a different concept of server components. So in the React server component world, we really define which component should be rendered on the client and which ones on the server. So it's a different approach that the Angular team takes here, but it's a quite interesting one. So they really strive for having a good developer experience, so that you do not need to adapt your whole code base to support this, but nevertheless have a very performant initial loading time, but also in future for the partial hydration, that you can really activate only parts of your whole Angular application.
Cool. I like it. Yeah, this was a really nice round trip across the new features, or selected of those new features, put into a very nice example. On the other side, those are quite a few topics. And I think you will talk about them in your workshop, in your modern Angular workshop. So can you tell us one or two sentences about this workshop?
Yes, exactly. Because we received the feedback from our customers that all the new APIs, as mentioned, are quite exciting, but nevertheless, there are also a lot of question marks, especially if it comes to when do I need to refactor, what do I need to refactor, what's the best strategy on how to decide which parts come first, and what's the most important, what are the most important APIs that I should focus on. Yeah, all of that's also about the process, not only about the features, but also how can I apply this in my my own Angular applications. This will be part of the Modern Angular workshop, so we will cover all the new APIs, but I will also give you some guidance on how you can put this into practice in your real-world projects, and not only in demo applications. And of course, we will also look in more complex examples. So as a quick spoiler, we will introduce a more generic navigation sidebar where we can provide navigation items with a lazily provided Angular configuration. So each time you load a specific feature lazily, you can also add navigation items to the sidebar and so on. So a more complex example than shown here, for example.
Cool. So let me quickly open the workshop website. This is recursion, or the part where I normally do a recursion joke. So let's go to Angular Architects.io, and let's switch to English, and let's go down. Here we already see Modern Angular Workshop. And when we click there, we see it's 2 days and it's in May. And there we see those two dudes. And here we have the agenda. So can we quickly go through the agenda so that we can find out what the chapters are about?
Yeah, definitely. So the block that you have already opened is already about standalone components, or the topic that we discussed in the beginning of this video. So it's not only about components; it's about directives and types, and basically we'll also talk on how you can refactor your current code base from ng modules to those standalone APIs, how routing is affected by that, how lazy loading is affected by that, and also how you could implement your own provider functions. So as we have no modules anymore, we have no static methods like for root or for child, and we will tackle that, of course, as well.
Nice. By the way, as I'm seeing this here, automatic migration to standalone, Does this really work?
Yeah, it works. It's actually a schematic implementation, so a code generator of the Angular CLI that is part of the core package, where you can really run a 3-step process to migrate your application. And you can really not only migrate the whole project or nothing, but you can also decide which passes, so which folder passes of your current project should be migrated to Standalone, for example. And at the end, for example, you can also migrate, refactor your bootstrapping.
Nice. Updated APIs. What's in there?
Quite a bunch, right? So new features for the Angular router, like functional guards, for example, new features for the HTTP client, like new interceptors, again, functional. What are the challenges in that area and how you declare them and how you can make them aware and define them for the Angular framework? What is also, how can we configure to use class-based interceptors together with functional interceptors? What's the connection to lazy loading in this case, and so on. We'll also discuss provider factories. So again, how we can implement configurable provider function calls, and of course also the inject method or inject function actually. So you can decide to use dependency injection not only with the constructor but also with the inject function. That's quite interesting, and we will tackle this in detail on how to use it and when to use it. Typed forms as well. So if requested feature from the community, long requested feature to have full type support for your Angular forms, quite an important one.
Cool, great. Yeah, then we talk about signals, something you have already shown, but even more, like I see here, compute, that effect, RxJS interop, stuff like this.
Definitely, we will talk about the whole reactive graph that the signals can construct for us. So that means, how does the whole reactivity work with this framework primitive that was created by the Angular team? What is a signal again, but also how can we implement derived state with the computed function? How can we react on signal changes with an effect? And how does this align with RxJS and also with the state management libraries like NGRX? What's the influence with data bindings? I already showed this a little bit in the live coding with the required input, but of course, there are also other APIs that we can use. There's also a function-based output possibility. It's not signal-based, but it allows us to emit events to our parent component and define this with a function call again instead of a decorator. Also, two-way binding is supported in a quite nice way, supporting signals directly. And the story continues with all the APIs that we use with parent and child components, like view children and content children. We will tackle those parts as well. What is the difference between content and view, but also how we can apply that on a signal-based level.
Nice. So built-in control flow, I think this is what we talked about. And here also seems like there is an automatic migration that actually works.
Yeah, definitely. So this is definitely something on a semantic level that can be easily converted. So an ng-for statement or an ng-if statement or an ng-switch statement can directly be converted automatically into the equivalence definition structure of the new control flow. That's quite a big assistance, because the schematics can refactor your whole code base.
Performance and data binding, not Datenbindung, but data binding. So this is still in German. I need to talk to the owner of this website, but we learn here.
Fine. Yeah. The defer block again, we of course will look into that in far more detail, discussing all the other triggers, not only the timer and the intersection observer, so the viewport related triggers, but also own triggers and preloading. And we'll also talk about server-side rendering and hydration. So what the framework actually gives you for the initial startup performance, also important for server-side, for search engine optimization. And we will also talk about local change detection. So what is the whole story about the changes of the Angular change detection with the signal-based components, but also the current features that we have right now. There are also performance improvements based on signals that already work even without signal-based components. And we will also discuss the future, what it means for an Angular application in future if we get rid of zone chess. We will of course tackle what is the responsibility of zone chess right now, and also why it is possible for the future to opt out of zone chess. So how our applications will update if zone chess is not present anymore. And as already mentioned today, also we'll tackle the fast builds with the new build pipeline, new builder ES build.
Awesome. And last but not least, we have a bonus chapter with best practices.
Yeah, definitely. So unidirectional data flow is something that is quite important for the framework. It's in future more orientated on the graph of signal changes and not directly on the graph of component changes anymore. So we'll tackle this as well. What does this mean for your applications? We can also talk about reactive flow in general. So how can we implement an Angular application with reactive patterns with RxJS, maybe also without RxJS, also combinations. So how can we convert signals into observables and also the other way around? So quite some interesting aspects if it comes to reactive programming in the future with Angular signals here as well. And the same for forms and validation. So there's also a planned new implementation by the Angular team, or planned adapted implementation for the forms chapter. And we'll of course also tackle how we can use form implementations today together with signals, and also together with signal-based state management solutions like the NGRX signal store, for example.
Awesome. So as we see here, those are quite a few topics. I'm really impressed, because normally you think, well, modern Angular is about 3 or 4 features that are really hyped. Everyone talks about it, but it really goes into depth. So I really like this agenda here.
Great. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I'm sure it will be a very interesting workshop. So yeah, if you ask yourself some questions about all the new APIs, yeah, just look into our homepage, and hopefully also this talk was interesting for you. Have fun with the new APIs, actually.
Cool. By the way, I'm linking the workshop below in the comments. Cool, Mikey. So big thanks for joining today. Big thanks for giving us such a concise overview of all the things modern Angular. I really liked your approach. Refactoring an existing application to a new state that uses all those features, at least a lot of them. So big thanks. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me, Manfred. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.